Well, last Wednesday, the UK government announced it had granted 24 new licences for companies to look for oil and gas in the North Sea. The news was greeted with derision by the Scottish government, who accused them of damaging the just transition. That, of course, is the move away from fossil fuels towards renewables. But the UK's Energy Minister, Graham Stewart, insisted it was common sense to make the most of our own resources. Then on Thursday, the greener economy was dealt another blow when Labour appeared to move away from a long-standing promise to spend £28 billion a year on green investment if they get into power. Well, I am joined now from Inverness by the SNP's Westminster economy spokesperson, Drew Hendry. Good morning. Can you hear me, Drew Hendry?
I can hear you.
You can hear me. Good
Thank
stuff.
you.
Good morning.
Yeah.
I was just saying good morning to you before we get underway. Listen, actually, talking to that, before we get underway with the energy stuff, I just must ask you, I've got the papers spread out in front of me. A lot of talk about the culture of government in the COVID inquiry last week. A couple of papers picking that up. There's talk of a culture of secrecy and cover-up, that theme going on. Sunday Times have got a civil service whistleblower saying there's an institutional paranoia of secrecy in the Scottish government. I know you're not a member of the Scottish government, but you are a member of the party of government. Not terribly good times in terms of public opinion, this, is it?
Well, I think the fact is that Scotland is the most scrutinised nation of the UK. We're holding our own inquiry, the only nation in the UK that's doing that. And indeed, we've got the most transparent freedom of information laws in the UK. So, you know, I think it's absolutely fair to scrutinise this. We need to learn lessons from COVID so that we can react better into the future. And I'm sure that the same scrutiny will be applied to Boris Johnson and to Rishi Sunak in England is being applied to here in the fullness of time.
Are you sure, or are you suggesting in a roundabout way that it isn't being applied?
No, I'm saying that if that's, you know, if the scrutiny that's applied in Scotland is applied in the rest of the UK, particularly with the UK government, then we'll probably learn a lot more than we are at the moment about how to deal with this into the future. Because as your previous item covered, it's important not only to learn lessons about the disease itself and how it develops into the future, but also how we deal with the pandemic into the future. And I think that should be not only transparent as it is here in Scotland, but transparent across the rest of the UK.
Well, indeed, as you say, that is the purpose, very much the purpose of the COVID inquiries. The headlines that they generated along the way are a consequence of some of the evidence, I suppose. Right, let's move away from that and move on to energy. That's what we're here to talk about this Sunday morning. As we said, 24 new North Sea exploration licences granted last week. Once again, the SNP very strongly against it. Cabinet Secretary for Energy, Neil Gray, said a total lack of focus on delivering a just transition. I would put it to you, this is actually part of just transition, isn't it? Keeping jobs, keeping energy companies in Scotland, stopping them from moving away. So when we are ready to bring up renewables to a scale that we'd want to be doing it, the expertise is still here.
Well, the deficit is in your explanation there, because the UK government is not making us ready to do the just transition. Look, oil and gas is going to be an important part of the economy and our daily needs for a period of time while we transition to green technologies. But the fact is that if you don't invest in that, those jobs in the oil and gas sector are at risk. And the fact is that we need more investment in that transition, not less investment. The UK government's taking an enormous amount of money in revenues from the North Sea at the moment, and they continue to be greedy to do that, as they have since oil was discovered in the North Sea, and doing the absolute bare minimum to reinvest in Scotland and its future. And this is just another example where it's another cash grab to take that money out without putting it back in what's required to make sure there's a long-term sustainable future for green investment. And indeed, the really important thing about this is to make sure that we're meeting our obligations under our climate change targets, which at the moment the UK government is failing terribly on.
Well, you're making all sorts your party has made all sorts of promises over the past decade and a half, and set all sorts of targets. The promises aren't being delivered, the targets aren't being met. Are you saying that's Westminster's fault?
No, the Scottish Government have invested £500 million. Don't forget, energy is a fully reserved matter to the UK Government. Yet the Scottish Government have invested £500 million in energy transition in the North East. That's failed to be matched by the UK Government. They failed to invest in Peterhead carbon capture and storage, over 10 years ago when they had the chance to take a lead. They're now miles and miles behind the US, which invested nearly $300 billion in the first year alone of the Inflation Reduction Act on new green technologies, miles and miles behind the EU in that investment. And again, all they're looking at is the short-term gain that they can get into the Treasury to try and prop up some of the policies which are frankly beggaring belief while people are facing a cost of living crisis across Scotland and the other nations of the UK.
Two things. Firstly, should we be turning that money away from the Treasury? Isn't it a good thing that the Treasury's coffers are boosted? And secondly, if these renewable jobs aren't coming on scale here in Scotland, isn't it absolutely essential that we keep some kind of energy industry here for the long term so that we're ready for it when they do? Because otherwise the industry will move and people will cease to think of us as the biggest player.
Well, every economic expert is backing up what I'm saying, that we need some of that money reinvested into the green economy just now. The Labour Party's own it, don't forget, the Labour Party backtracking on their £28 billion a year promise. That is an absolute bare minimum, according to the economists who are advising the Labour Party themselves, that's needed in the green transition. I've given you an example of how far behind the UK is in terms of its international comparisons. This is a really dangerous time in terms of both the future economy, because there are limited opportunities for the UK to invest in the future for the UK and especially for Scotland. And one of them is in green investment, where we continue, because the Scottish Government have used their environmental powers, no policy powers because they're reserved, to try and help renewable technologies become part of our mix so that we can now export electricity, having just the past couple of weeks managed to get 100% of our electricity production here in Scotland. We're already exporting oil and gas as well. All of these things are Scotland's resources at the moment, which are being absolutely squandered by the UK Treasury with no investment back. And I've given you numerous examples of where that investment has failed to be made over the past number of years, and it continues to fail to be made. And the Labour Party look as though they're going to be equally complicit in making that mistake.
Well, we asked the Labour Party to come on and discuss that this morning. They wouldn't put anybody up to come on and be interviewed on the Sunday show. Let me ask you this. Is there still, in your party, in the Scottish Government, a presumption against granting licences in the North Sea? I asked that because I heard on a podcast this week Gillian Martin, the Energy Minister, suggesting she didn't really like the idea. She certainly wasn't a fan of the wording, if not the attitude.
No, I think the First Minister has been crystal clear that any new oil and gas licences have to meet our climate change target obligations. They have to be reviewed in line with what we need to do in order to make sure that we're meeting our targets. But part of that ongoing need, I said right at the beginning of this piece, Martin, part of that ongoing need for oil and gas is going to be there. But we need to make sure it's done in a way that makes sure we've got a just transition from oil and gas, saving all those jobs, making sure all that investment continues to be, making sure that we've got energy security. But the real difficulty at the moment is the UK government are not doing that at all. They're ignoring this, burying their head in the sand, taking the money, saying thank you very much, and failing to reinvest that in Scotland. And indeed, since we're still in the UK at the moment, failing to reinvest that for the rest of the UK as well, because they're just not making the decisions that need to be made. And neither are the Labour Party.
OK, but back to my question. Let's talk about your party. There is still absolutely, in word and in attitude, a presumption against granting new licences. That will continue.
I've been very clear in what I've said, that any new oil and gas...
It's just that the Energy Minister was injecting some ambiguity in that.
Well, look, I'm telling you what the First Minister has said, that
It's a bit of a worry if they don't sing off the same hymn sheet, isn't it?
Well, I think it's very, very clear, Martin. Any new oil and gas licences have to go through that test. As I've said, we do have to live in a world where oil and gas is going to be with us for a period of time. But we also need to make sure that we're doing the just transition. And doing the just transition means making the sensible decisions for our economy, for our planet, for our people that need to be made at the moment, not just burying your head in the sand with this. Don't forget, at the moment, we're paying a fortune for electricity. People are struggling with their bills, paying a fortune for gas. There's a real cost of living crisis for people particularly across Scotland. The north of Scotland here, for example, where we're paying where we have a colder climate, where we have higher energy bills, and we have the highest level of fuel poverty, and yet we're exporting all of this energy, and there's being nothing of any serious nature being reinvested in that aspect of it to help people, nor into the new jobs of the future.
Let me ask you this then. They're talking about domestic bills, the cost of living crisis. There's a big target. You've put a big target upon yourselves. 25,000 homes to be converted to green heating per year. The last year, the figures are available for 2022, there were 5,000. You've got to do 200,000 by the end of the decade. You're miles off it. Why is that?
Well, when you saw with the last autumn statement and then the finance bill, the Chancellor cut £19 billion from the public sector.
This is Westminster's fault again. You set your targets.
Well, look, you know, we set a target based on the fact that you look as though you look to get an equitable redistribution of funds from UK government decisions. And what the UK government decisions
you're doing 5,000 a year. You've got 195,000 to do in the next 6.
Well, in that case,
that can't all be down to the Chancellor.
Well, it's very much down to money, as you know, Martin, and money has been cut from the Scottish budget. I've just given you an example of another cut that's to come that hasn't been highlighted or picked up by news programmes to any great extent. That's coming down the track, and if the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, does further tax cuts in the forthcoming budget statement, then it looks like he'll be raiding the public purse even further to do that. Less money in the economy, less money for settlements means less can be done. And that's the reality of the decisions that are being taken at Westminster at the moment.
I tell you what, Labour, I mean, everybody's been quick to jump on the back of Labour, who are saying, well, we're rethinking now our £28 billion a year pledge on the green economy. Isn't that just being pragmatic? Couldn't everybody else take a lesson from that? Shouldn't you roll back some of your expenditure, some of your plans and some of the punishing targets that you're failing to meet until things are a bit sunnier?
Well, nothing's pragmatic about cutting investment in one of the few industries that we can possibly go forward with in the UK. As I said, even the Labour Party's own economic advisors, the former CEO of Siemens, has said that the £28 billion is the minimum required. Now, I'm quite proud to live in a country that has high targets, and some of them are very, very difficult to achieve, but at least we've set the ambition. It doesn't look as though Labour have got any ambition at all here by cutting this absolutely vital funding. We live in a time of climate change. We live in a time of a situation where we should be making active moves to transition. And yet they're completely ignoring this.
Drew Hendry, as I said, we asked them to come on. They didn't come on. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
We are out of time. That is it.